In a world of glittering opulence and aching heartbreak, Daniel Harrington, a wealthy groom left at the altar, finds solace in the quiet beauty of his estate and the unexpected warmth of Sophie, its humble caretaker. A journey of healing turns into a love story where fate rewrites destiny with magic and sincerity. The Harrington estate gleamed with opulence that day, its grandeur heightened by the anticipation of a high society wedding. Guests adorned in designer couture filled the grand ballroom, which was decorated with cascading floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers. Every detail exuded perfection, exactly what one would expect from Daniel Harrington, a man accustomed to excellence. Daniel stood in front of the mirror in his private suite, adjusting the diamond cufflinks on his tailored suit. At 32, he was the epitome of charm and success. The CEO of a flourishing tech empire, Daniel had a reputation for getting what he wanted. And today, he was marrying Emily Whitmore, the dazzling socialite who seemed like the perfect match for his polished life. But as the clock ticked closer to the ceremony, a gnawing sense of unease began to creep in. Emily was running late. A discreet knock at the door broke through his thoughts. It was his mother. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she handed him a folded note. "Daniel," she said softly, "we need to talk." Daniel unfolded the note with trembling hands, his heart pounding as he read the handwritten words. "Daniel, I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I've realized we want different things. You deserve someone who truly loves you, not just the idea of you." Emily. For a moment, Daniel's world tilted. The ballroom, the guests, the vows, all meaningless now. The humiliation was sharp, but the deeper wound came from the betrayal. Emily wasn't just a partner, she was a carefully planned part of his future. And now she was gone. The once lively estate seemed eerily silent as Daniel stepped into the ballroom. Rows of lavishly dressed guests turned to him with expectant eyes, their whispers spreading like wildfire. Swallowing his pride, Daniel walked up to the wedding planner and calmly announced the cancellation. He instructed his assistant to manage the inevitable media frenzy. As the crowd began to disperse, he caught fragments of murmurs. Poor Daniel. How humiliating. Every glance, every whispered word felt like a dagger. Emily's absence wasn't just personal, it was a public spectacle. By the time Daniel reached his penthouse that evening, he was emotionally drained. The expansive, empty space seemed to echo his loneliness. Reminders of Emily lingered everywhere, a scarf draped over a chair, her favorite bottle of wine in the fridge. Each item deepened the ache in his chest. Pouring himself a glass of whiskey, he sank into the couch, staring out at the city lights. The vibrant skyline offered no comfort. For the first time in years, Daniel felt truly lost. Or the next day, the tabloids were merciless. Headlines screamed about the wedding of the century that wasn't, dissecting every detail of the scandal. Friends and business associates called to express their sympathy, but Daniel's responses were curt. He wanted none of it. In the quiet of his penthouse, Daniel stared at his untouched breakfast. His phone buzzed incessantly, but he ignored it. The betrayal had cut deeper than he had anticipated. Emily's departure forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had been more in love with the idea of a perfect partnership than with Emily herself. Desperate for solace, Daniel decided to leave the city. He retreated to his secluded mountain estate, a place he rarely visited but always found peaceful. The sprawling property overlooked a serene lake and was surrounded by dense woods. It was the perfect escape. Upon arrival, he was greeted by Sophie Bennett, the estate's caretaker. Sophie, in her late 20s, had warm hazel eyes and an unassuming grace. She had worked for the Harrington family for years, quietly tending to the estate's needs. Unlike the people in Daniel's usual circle, Sophie exuded a genuine kindness. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrington," Sophie said with a soft smile. "I've prepared your room and stocked the kitchen. Let me know if there's anything else you need." Daniel nodded, his response polite but distant. He had no interest in pleasantries. All he wanted was solitude. Yet as days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself observing Sophie more closely. She moved with quiet confidence, humming softly as she tended to the garden or fixed minor repairs around the estate. Unlike the polished, image-conscious women he was used to, Sophie's simplicity was refreshing. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sophie approached with a tray of tea. "Thought you might like this," she said, setting it down. "Thank you," Daniel replied, surprised by the gesture. They sat in silence for a while, the orange hues of the sky reflecting off the lake. Finally, Sophie spoke. "I know it's none of my business, but I'm sorry for what happened with your wedding. It must have been hard." Her words, devoid of pity, carried a sincerity that caught Daniel off guard. For the first time, he felt a flicker of comfort. "It was," he admitted, his voice low, "but I'm starting to realize it might have been for the best." Sophie nodded, her hazel eyes meeting his. "Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan, but it has a way of leading us to where we're meant to be." Her words lingered long after she left. Daniel began to notice the small, thoughtful things Sophie did. A warm meal left on the kitchen counter when she knew he'd skipped lunch. Freshly cut flowers arranged on the porch table. Slowly, the walls he'd built around his heart began to crack. The estate, once a place of retreat, started to feel like something more, a haven. Late one night, Daniel found himself gazing at the stars from the porch. Sophie joined him, carrying a steaming mug of cocoa. "The night sky here is magical," she murmured. "It makes you feel like anything is possible." Daniel turned to her, his voice quiet. "Do you really believe that?" Sophie's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "I do. Even after the hardest times, there's always a way forward." For the first time since Emily had left, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. Sophie's words weren't just comforting, they were transformative. As the night stretched on, they talked about their dreams, their fears, and the unexpected twists of life. It was a conversation Daniel hadn't realized he needed until that moment. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself seeking out Sophie's company more and more. What began as fleeting conversations on the porch gradually turned into shared meals and long walks around the lake. Sophie's stories, about her small-town upbringing, her love for books, and her dream of traveling the world, captivated him. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled in the distance, Daniel wandered into the library. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by old books. She looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said. "I needed a change of scenery," he replied, leaning against the doorway. "What are you reading?" She held up a worn novel. "Just an old classic. Sometimes the simplest stories carry the most meaning." Daniel walked over and sat beside her. The warmth of the room contrasted with the storm outside, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he felt at ease. Their laughter echoed through the library as Sophie read aloud her favorite passages, her enthusiasm infectious. Later that evening, Sophie prepared a simple but delicious meal. They ate together in the cozy dining room, the sound of rain pattering against the windows. As Sophie recounted a funny story from her past, Daniel found himself laughing freely. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest felt lighter, A rhythm soon developed in their days. Daniel joined Sophie for coffee in the mornings, their conversations drifting from light-hearted banter to deeper, more personal reflections. Sophie's openness encouraged Daniel to share the parts of himself he had long kept hidden, his fears of failure, his doubts about the life he had built, and the lingering ache from Emily's betrayal. Sophie listened with quiet empathy, her presence soothing in a way he hadn't known he needed. One sunny afternoon, they decided to take the boat out onto the lake. Sophie steered, her hair catching in the gentle breeze. Daniel couldn't help but admire her natural beauty. "You look happy out here," he remarked. She glanced at him, her hazel eyes sparkling. "This place has always felt like a little slice of magic, don't you think?" Daniel nodded. "I'm starting to see it. For the first time in years, I feel like I can finally breathe again." As they drifted in the middle of the lake, Sophie leaned back, her gaze fixed on the clear blue sky. "I think life has a funny way of giving us what we need," she said softly, "even if it's not what we thought we wanted." Her words struck a chord deep within Daniel. He wanted to tell her how much she had come to mean to him, how her presence had brought light to his darkest days. But the words caught in his throat, tangled with uncertainty. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and pink, Daniel lingered on the porch with Sophie. The air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers, and the gentle hum of cicadas filled the quiet. He broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what makes someone truly happy?" Sophie turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's different for everyone. For me, it's the little things. A good book, a kind word, the feeling of being understood. What about you?" He hesitated, then said softly, "I think I'm still figuring that out, but lately I've realized it might not be what I've always thought. Maybe it's less about what I have and more about who I'm with." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. Sophie's cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked away. But not before Daniel caught a flicker of something unspoken in her gaze, a fragile thread connecting them in a way neither dared to fully acknowledge. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, their conversations replayed in his mind. Sophie was unlike anyone he had ever met, genuine, kind, and unpretentious. He realized he was no longer consumed by thoughts of Emily or the life he had left behind. His thoughts were filled with Sophie and the possibility of something new, something real. But with that realization came fear. Could he risk his heart again, especially with someone whose world was so different from his own? The questions lingered, unanswered, as sleep finally claimed him. The days at the estate grew longer and brighter, mirroring the shift in Daniel's outlook. His moments with Sophie became more frequent, layered with subtle but unmistakable undertones. He found himself anticipating her laughter, her insight, and even the quiet pauses in their conversations that felt charged with an unfamiliar yet exhilarating energy. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, Daniel awkwardly attempting to plant flowers under Sophie's amused guidance, he caught himself staring at her. The sunlight danced across her face, highlighting the stray strands of hair slipping from her braid. Her movements were fluid and unhurried, and the way she threw her head back when she laughed mesmerized him. "You're terrible at this," Sophie teased, gesturing at the crooked line of flowers he had planted. Daniel chuckled, brushing dirt from his hands. "Not everyone can be a gardening expert like you." "Expert?" she replied, raising an eyebrow. "You're giving me far too much credit." "No," he said softly, his tone suddenly serious. "I don't think I am." The change in his voice made Sophie pause, her breath catching as their eyes met. For a moment, the air between them felt thick with unspoken words. Sophie quickly looked away, pretending to busy herself with the soil, but the moment lingered in Daniel's mind long after. That evening, as the golden hues of sunset bathed the estate, Daniel found himself walking towards Sophie's cottage. He hesitated at her door, hand raised to knock. Just as doubt began to creep in, the door opened, and Sophie appeared, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Daniel, is everything okay?" she asked, her hazel eyes searching his. "I needed to see you," he said simply, his voice steady, yet tinged with vulnerability. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The cozy warmth of her cottage enveloped them, the scent of lavender and freshly baked bread lingering in the air. Sophie gestured for him to sit, but Daniel remained standing, his gaze locked on her. "I've been trying to find the right moment to say this," he began, his words slow but deliberate. "Being here with you, it's changed me. You've shown me a world I didn't know I needed. And it's not just the estate or the quiet. It's you, Sophie. You make me want to be better. You make me want to live differently." Sophie's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "Daniel, I don't know what to say. This feels so overwhelming." He took a step closer, his voice softening. "I know it's a lot, and I know we're different in so many ways, but none of that matters to me. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you. You make me feel alive, Sophie, and I can't ignore that anymore." Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to process his words. "Daniel, I'm just me. I'm not from your world. I don't fit into the life you come from." "Maybe that's why it feels so right," he countered gently. "For the first time, I'm not thinking about expectations or appearances. I'm thinking about what makes me happy, and that's you." Her defenses faltered, her emotions spilling over. "I'm scared, Daniel. What if this doesn't work? What if you go back to your life and realize I'm not enough?" He reached out, his hands taking hers. "You are more than enough, Sophie, and I'm not going back to the life I had. I don't want it without you." The sincerity in his voice unraveled her final doubts. Sophie felt the weight of her fears lifting, replaced by a tentative hope she hadn't dared to feel before. "Daniel, I don't know where this will lead, but I can't deny how I feel either." Relief washed over him as he stepped even closer, his hands gently cradling her face. "That's all I needed to hear." As the space between them disappeared, their connection deepened in an unspoken promise. Daniel leaned in, and Sophie met him halfway, their lips brushing in a tender, heartfelt kiss. It was a moment of courage and trust, of a love neither had anticipated, but both were willing to embrace. The evening melted into night as they sat by the fire, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and desires. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't known existed. And for Sophie, it was a joy she had once thought out of reach. Their bond grew stronger with each passing moment, and though the path ahead was uncertain, they both knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The tranquility of Daniel and Sophie's budding relationship was interrupted one crisp morning, a disruption as unwelcome as the frost clinging to the windows. The phone call came as Daniel sipped his coffee, enjoying the soft hum of Sophie's laughter as she read a book nearby. The voice on the other end was hesitant but firm. "Emily's back in town, Daniel. She wants to see you." The words landed like a stone in his chest. Emily, the woman who had abandoned him at the altar, was now seeking his attention. What could she possibly want? Confusion and unease wrestled within him as he glanced at Sophie. She had noticed the tension in his posture, her gaze steady and concerned, silently asking the question he dreaded answering. After ending the call, Daniel set the phone down with a sigh and turned toward her. "That was someone from my past," he began carefully. "Emily wants to meet." Sophie's expression didn't falter, but Daniel saw a flicker of unease in her hazel eyes. "Do you think it's a good idea?" she asked, her tone even but tinged with worry. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But maybe I need closure. I owe it to myself and to us to put this chapter behind me." Sophie nodded, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "If you feel like you need to go, you should. Just don't let her pull you back into something you've moved past." Her quiet strength reassured him, but Daniel couldn't ignore the crack in her voice. Reaching for her hand, he squeezed it gently. "I'll go, but only to make it clear where my life is now." The cafe was small and unassuming, a far cry from the opulence of their shared past. Emily sat at a corner table, her posture rigid, but her eyes darting anxiously toward the door. When Daniel stepped inside, she rose to greet him, her smile tentative and unsure. "Daniel," she began softly, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming." He nodded but didn't return her smile, letting silence press her toward the truth. "I made a mistake," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she continued. "Leaving you was the hardest decision I've ever made. I thought I wanted freedom, but all I found was emptiness. I've spent every day since regretting it. I want to fix things between us, Daniel, if you'll let me." Her words hung in the air, but they stirred nothing in Daniel. What once might have reopened old wounds now only brought clarity. "Emily," he said calmly, his voice steady, "I appreciate your honesty, but what we had is in the past. I've moved on, and I've found someone who makes me truly happy." Emily's face crumpled as tears spilled over. "I understand," she whispered. "I just needed to tell you how I felt. I'm sorry for everything." As Daniel walked away from the cafe, an unexpected sense of relief washed over him. The encounter had given him closure he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time in years, he felt free from the shadows of his past. Sophie was waiting for him on the porch when he returned to the estate. She looked up as he approached, her eyes a mixture of hope and apprehension. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Daniel stopped in front of her, his expression softening. "It's over," he said simply. "I told her there's nothing left between us. My future is here, with you." Sophie's shoulders relaxed, a soft smile breaking across her face. "I'm glad," she said quietly, "because I don't think I could bear to lose you." Daniel stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "You'll never lose me, Sophie. You've given me a second chance at life, and I'm not letting go of that." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy and relief. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, as if anchoring himself to the present. That evening, they walked along the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden hues reflecting on the water's surface. Sophie slipped her hand into Daniel's, and he held it firmly, their steps falling into perfect rhythm. "Do you think life always has a way of leading us to where we're meant to be?" Sophie asked softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Daniel turned to her, his heart full. "It does. I'm certain of it now. Everything I've been through brought me here. To you." Sophie's smile widened, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm glad it did," she whispered. As the night fell and the stars emerged, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the crisp air. The quiet of the estate felt alive with the promise of new beginnings. Though challenges might still lie ahead, they knew their bond was strong enough to weather them. Together, they had found a love that felt like home. The days that followed were filled with a renewed sense of purpose for Daniel and Sophie. Their bond had deepened, and with every shared glance, touch, and conversation, they felt more certain of their place in each other's lives. However, Daniel couldn't shake the desire to show Sophie just how much she meant to him. Words, though meaningful, felt inadequate. He wanted to do something more, something extraordinary. One morning, as Sophie stood by the garden, her hands dusted with soil and her hair tied back in a messy braid, Daniel approached her, his tone filled with excitement. "Sophie," he began, his eyes alight with anticipation, "I have a surprise for you." She turned, her curiosity piqued, her hazel eyes gleaming. "A surprise? What kind of surprise?" "You'll see," he teased, gently taking her hand. "Come with me." They walked hand in hand toward the estate's small boathouse. Sophie's curiosity grew with every step as she noticed the rowboat, carefully prepared with a picnic basket and soft blankets. "We're going out on the lake?" she asked, her smile widening with delight. Daniel nodded, helping her into the boat. "There's something I want to show you." As they glided across the serene water, Sophie leaned back, feeling the gentle breeze kiss her skin. The lake shimmered under the midday sun, and the distant sounds of birds created a peaceful melody. Daniel rowed with ease, though his eyes occasionally drifted to Sophie, who looked utterly at peace. They reached a secluded corner of the lake where tall willows dipped their branches into the water, forming a natural canopy. Daniel anchored the boat and turned to Sophie, his voice soft and filled with affection. "Close your eyes," he said, his smile tender. "Daniel," she laughed nervously, "what are you up to?" "Trust me," he replied, his voice warm and reassuring. Sophie's heart raced with anticipation, and she complied, her breath quickening as the boat shifted slightly. She could hear faint rustling, followed by the soft sound of something unfolding. "You can open your eyes now," he said. When Sophie opened her eyes, she gasped. The small area beneath the willows had been transformed into a magical setting. Fairy lights hung from the branches, casting a soft, golden glow. A small table floated near the boat, set with her favorite flowers, delicate china, and a plate of freshly baked pastries. "Daniel," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. It's beautiful." He reached for her hands, pulling her closer, his eyes filled with emotion. "I wanted to create something special for you, Sophie, because you've made my life feel magical again." They sat together, sharing the quiet intimacy of the moment. As they talked and laughed, Daniel felt a growing certainty. Sophie wasn't just the woman who had helped him heal, she was his future. After the meal, Daniel stood, his heart racing with the weight of what he was about to do. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice a little shakier than before. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box and without hesitation dropped to one knee. The boat rocked slightly beneath him. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and emotion. "Sophie Bennett," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the rush of nerves. "You came into my life when I needed you most. You've shown me what it means to truly love and be loved. I don't want to imagine a future without you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled from Sophie's eyes as she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Daniel, yes, of course I will." With shaking hands, Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and then pulled her into his arms. The world around them seemed to dissolve, leaving only the two of them, enveloped in the love they shared. As they rode back to the estate, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold, Sophie rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, content and at peace. "You know," she murmured, "life really does have a way of surprising us." Daniel smiled, pressing a soft kiss to her hair. "It does. And I'm grateful every day for the way it brought me to you." They returned to the estate, greeted by the warm glow of the house and the promise of a new chapter. Together they had found love in the most unexpected place, a love that felt like destiny and home all at once,